Sure.
Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi kia tātou, ko James Palmer Ahua, ko Group Manager Strategic Development Ahua.
Well done. Tēnā koe.
It's my pleasure to introduce to the Regional Planning Committee for the first time Mary-Ann Baker, who has joined us as a Senior Planner from the Tasman District Council. Mary-Ann has extensive experience in water management planning and with collaborative processes, and so will become familiar to the committee with our deliberations, particularly in relation to the tank project, but a range of other matters. So I'm going to hand over at this point to Mary-Ann.
Thank you. So this paper will probably take a lot less time than the previous one. It's going to be a fairly brief overview of the application for the conservation order application over the Ngaruroro and Clive rivers, and a quick look at the implications of that. The paper's not about the merits or the content of the application, it's about process, the kind of process that the council and the community want to follow in terms of identifying values and adopting the most appropriate way of providing for those. So there was a
sorry, Mike's got all this rubbish here. Putting over half the desk.
So an application has been made to the Minister for the Environment for the Ngaruroro and Clive rivers, and the applicants are, as on the board and in your papers. A couple of the applicants are represented at a national level, but also at a local level on the tank group. And there are a couple of national bodies that aren't represented on the tank group, the Jet Boating and the Whitewater New Zealand. The outcomes sought by the applicants are the preservation of the upper Ngaruroro in its natural state, the lower Ngaruroro in its current modified state, and the Clive River in its current modified state. This is about process in terms of how the community arrives at the appropriate protection, how it identifies the values and develops the appropriate objectives and limits to provide for those values. So in terms of the process for a water conservation order, it goes to the Minister for the Environment to decide. He can decide if there is more information required or accept or decline the application. And if it's accepted, the Minister sets up a special tribunal to run the process and to hear submissions and make recommendations. And the Minister reports those recommendations and a recommendation for a decision to the Cabinet. And the Council role in that process is a submitter only and also provider of information. So the type of process that the water conservation order follows is more an adversarial one. The stakeholders will determine their own positions and defend those in a hearing process. And the comparison can be made with the tank process, which is a more structured and collaborative process that's got multiple aims that include involving stakeholders, involving them in terms of understanding the issues and the resources that are being managed, and improve understanding and make recommendations to the Council for regional plan provisions. So the two processes, they have big implications for the Council, its roles and its responsibilities. And one of the perhaps more significant ones for the Council is the impact on the recently constituted Regional Planning Committee, yourselves. The resource management decisions are made by the Tribunal and the Minister, not by the Council, not by the Committee. Such a process will also impact or risk diversion of efforts of the Council in implementing the National Policy Statement for Fresh Water, and will also, of course, divert or risk diverting resources from the tank-focused processes and science programs and policy team. In terms of implications for the community, it will intersect with what the tank group are trying to do, particularly in relation, of course, to the Ngaruroro and the Clive rivers. But what it also does is create a lot of confusion in the minds of the public. What process is doing what and how to be involved, what does it all mean? So there's lots of additional confusion and also costs, because it means that stakeholder groups have to be part of two separate processes looking at doing similar things. There are risks to the continuation even of the tank group. If the water conservation order is seeking the same outcomes as a tank process, then there'll be questions about, well, why would you continue with being involved in a tank group when some other process might ride over the top of local initiatives? It's also going to affect role of the local members of the tank group that are also related to the applicant groups, either at a local or a national level, and will affect how they can operate in a collaborative process when their organisations have already made a statement or a position in relation to some aspects of what the tank group is seeking to do. And it's likely also to affect to reflect the already established relationships that the tank group process has enabled to happen over the time that it's worked together. There are other aspects that are of potential significance in relation to the way that the water conservation order process and requirements intersect with the national policy statement. The water conservation order only addresses a limited range of the in-stream values, not the whole range of values that a water body might have. The NPS, the National Policy Statement, however, requires the council and the community to look at all the values of a water body and make the appropriate provisions for those. There is a tension too in the way that the water conservation order addresses outstanding values, and the National Policy Statement also uses that terminology. And the council itself is involved in an investigation and some research around what does the word outstanding mean in the various contexts in which it's used, and to develop some kind of assessment or methodology that helps the council and also the rest of New Zealand, for that matter, in working out how they both identify and assess the outstanding water bodies, or the significant values of those outstanding water bodies. So that work's underway, and I'm actually not sure of the time frame, but I think this year it's due for completion this year. However, the water conservation order actually has a more enduring effect than a regional plan. It's protected for a couple of years, and it recognises values at a national level, not just the local level. And so there is a potential for the council and the community working through this tank process to establish the significant values and provide for them, and at some later date to reflect those in a water conservation order that essentially adds icing to the cake, which is the regional plan. So the recommendations by staff are to advise the Minister of its concerns, to advise the Minister about the Council's own water management processes and the science programs that it's already got in place, and to outline to the Minister its concerns about the impact and the effect of a water conservation order on those processes and programs. And they include the effect of that process and the decision-making process on the Council and the RPC roles and responsibilities in managing water, and the impact on the tank process and the stakeholders that are involved in the tank process, the impact it has on efficient and effective stakeholder engagement, in that there is quite an impact in terms of both costs and time in having two processes, which of course is not efficient use of anybody's resources, and also the impact it has on the Council's own science programs and the risk of diversion from those, given the need for some haste in setting limits and ensuring that the regional plan is doing the right job. And to request the Minister, as a result of all of that, that the application be rejected for the water conservation order.
Chairman, with your indulgence, I'd just like to make a couple of other points. The water conservation order instrument in legislation is a very old and dated instrument. It predates the RMA and does not sit particularly comfortably with current freshwater reform. Hence, the national policy statement also trying to deal with outstanding water values and water bodies simultaneously. So there is a little bit of confusion in statute, which central government's currently trying to work its way through. I would note that what's particularly significant about this application in terms of its complicating our planning processes is the pervasiveness of the application. Water conservation orders have typically been described as the national parks of our water management, or of our water bodies, if you like. This application, because it brings in groundwater, because it brings in the Karamu and Clive catchment, and it also is the full reach of the Ngaruroro. The consequence of that is that you're looking to essentially establish national park over a heavily modified environment which is currently underpinning significant natural resource use in the community. So had the water conservation order been proposed for the upper reaches of the Ngaruroro only, as has been talked about by a range of stakeholders for quite some time, we'd be talking about quite a different proposition. And so as it stands at the moment, there is no question that this does cut across the planning functions that are mandated by this body for the tank process, and if it does proceed, we're going to have to come back to this table in the fullness of time with a complete rethink about how we're going to take the tank proposal forward.
Thank you. Let's have some questions. Ms. Hopmans.
Kia ora, thank you for that. I heard the comment and I saw in the report that a water conservation order doesn't look at anything other than in-stream values. Is that what you said? So it doesn't look at all the other factors.
It doesn't look at things like irrigation values or the economic abstractive uses, no.
Right, because one of my concerns was that actually when I had a look at, we had a copy of some provisions about the water conservation orders put in the front of our papers, and under section 207, it actually says that the matters to be considered by a special tribunal would include the relevant provisions of every national policy statement. So to me, it sounded like actually any tribunal looking at this will be looking at the national policy statement for freshwater management. Would that be your view?
It would have to take it into account, but it's only looking at those in-stream values. It's not looking at providing for any of the other values that might be identified. And it's also not enabling an integrated approach to managing those values, which includes looking at the land and how you manage the land use rules. Water conservation order can't go that far either.
I feel a bit torn when we look at these provisions. And as James said, obviously water conservation orders were in there, I think, from day one, but then the Crown has come in and made a provision for a national policy statement for freshwater management, and these things don't fit together very well, it seems. One seems to be trying to supersede the other. Just looking at the way the RMA is structured to work, though, it does seem that people like Ngāti Hori, and I see we've got whānau here, have the right to seek a water conservation order. They have the right to do that. And that's what the RMA prioritises. And I noticed that it's notwithstanding, any decision is notwithstanding Part 2. And my concern would be about all the Māori values and other values that you're required to look at in Part 2. But I would still say that a tribunal couldn't ignore that. However, we're in an awkward position where you have the right to do that, and what we're asking a minister to do is to reject, effectively decline to consider the application any further, because we're involved in another process that we've committed a lot of resources to. But if I was to put on my Ngāti Hori hat, and I haven't spoken to Ngāti Hori about it, and I wanted to protect that, and I had been involved in a collaborative process since 2012, I might have decided I've had enough and it's not working, and actually I still want this outstanding water body protected, so I'm going to go straight to a decision maker, be it the minister through a special tribunal, and have that put, because the collaborative process is not meeting my ends, my needs. And I know they've been criticised, or the people who've made the application have been criticised for that, but isn't this just what the RMA provides for? And I know they don't sit well, but that is currently the position. So coming back to the question, would it be valid for the minister to decline this application on the basis that, well, we happen to be doing a plan change process, which may take another how many ever years to complete? Is that going to be a valid reason for the minister to decline an application that might otherwise be worthwhile?
There doesn't seem to be anything in the Act itself to determine how or why a minister makes its decision. But as I said at the beginning, it's not about the merits of the conservation order and what it's seeking. I don't think that is the debate that we need to have. It's about the process you arrive at to both understand and provide for those values. It's the process, and it's how you use people's energies, relationships and resources to get through the right kind of process.
And can I just return us to the pervasiveness of this application? There are, so it includes areas within the catchment that will quite probably not meet the test of outstanding, and probably, certainly in my judgment, not receive the level of protection that might be afforded in the upper reaches of the catchment. And so the practical effect of a tribunal considering this and going through the process is that they will spend an awful lot of our time and money as a council and as a community considering a bunch of matters that will ultimately not result in protection in the WCO instruments. Almost certainly you can see that the WCO instrument that would come out at the end would have a focus on the upper reaches where those values are truly outstanding. Meanwhile, we would have probably lost a couple of years' progress on the tank process, and significantly complicated our ability to give effect to the MPSFM 2014.
Further questions? Councillor Belford.
So if we take this recommendation, are we not asking a whole range of parties who have indicated serious grievances with the tank process to accept that, despite all that, it's a better way, as Tanya says, it somehow represents a better way to get the outcome those aggrieved parties want? Couldn't one argue that we fix tank first so that there is actually an option that some of these folks would feel comfortable buying into?
So that essentially sits in behind the recommendation here, is that we do get tank back on track, and it's obviously the next item on the agenda for us to discuss. And as Marianne noted, there will always be, as long as it remains under statute, the opportunity for members of the community to initiate a WCO process at the end of it. And given that we have to, under the NPS, identify and protect significant values of outstanding water bodies in the tank process anyway, I would suggest that we complete that process, and then at the end of it, if the applicants or anybody else feels that any outstanding value has not been provided for through the community-led planning process, by all means they could initiate a tribunal to consider whether or not we have indeed reflected those outstanding values and protected them. And so that would be the appropriate time for an instrument of this nature to be invoked.
Councillor Dick, I'll work up the table actually. Councillor Dick.
Mr. Chairman, would it not add some value to the communication, if in fact we resolve to do it, to advise the Minister that should the application have been in relation to the upper reaches of the Ngaruroro, that it is possible that the council may have supported that.
from a council policy and planning perspective, I think the process issues we would believe are best done holistically across the whole catchment in an integrated fashion first, and then a WCO, as per my previous comments, should be considered. It will still complicate the tank process having an application in the upper reaches, but it would be significantly less complicated than the current application as it stands. So that's an option for the Regional Planning Committee in terms of how you'd like to reflect your sentiments to the Minister. But I would say to you that it doesn't solve the problem, it reduces the complexity of it, and our preferred recommendation as staff is that the WCO be declined in its current form and that a WCO be considered after we've completed the plan change process.
Okay, I
Can I
can buy that, sorry, but in the letter, I think some expression of your view, as you've just put it now, would be helpful.
Do you have a supplementary to that?
To that? No.
I'll come back to you. Councillor Scott, then Councillor Bevan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, if I could ask Mr. Palmer or Ms. Baker, and welcome to sunny Napier, even more sunny Hawke's Bay, even more sunnier than Tasman. You've made a good move. You raised the spectre of the narrowness of the values that can be considered under this, but clearly within this reach there are existing irrigation takes. Could you clarify for us, given the fact that the Water Conservation Order does have water allocation limits or water flow limits, the effect that has on an existing take, and what happens with renewals? Are renewals actually under the Act a straightforward process of renewal, or are they treated as a new consent and therefore subject to the new minimum flows, should that be established through a Water Conservation Order?
They're essentially a new application under the Act. There are some provisions that recognise existing use and existing investment and provide some priority under the Act. The Council can also write rules to reflect existing use through its rule structure, but the Council currently doesn't have those provisions. So under the current system of rules and provisions, it would be essentially a new application that would have to still take into account the restrictions or the provisions of the Water Conservation Order when the application's made, the consent application's made.
Thank you. Councillor Bevan.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks for your presentation, Marianne. Did I understand you to say before that the current values and characteristics under a WCO are locked in?
The Water Conservation Order identifies values for which it wants protection. So the Conservation Order would recognise those in the structure of the order and provide for them through restrictions or provisions around flows and levels.
As they currently exist?
No, they could be new ones, or as applied for in the order, or as amended through the submission and hearing process.
Okay, so because I'd like to think that through the tank process we'd actually improve some of these waterways, make them better rather than... Because I've got some sympathy with James's view that certainly in the lower reaches of the Ngaruroro and the Karamu and the Clive, I'm struggling to think of outstanding natural characteristics. So is it possible that the Minister might look at this and say, I'll grant this to go further in part and just take part of the waterways under discussion?
Under the Act, the Minister doesn't have the ability to proceed with part of it, so it's either all or nothing. And as Marianne suggested, there's nothing in the legislation to guide that decision. It's a binary decision that he makes and he makes alone. It's a yes/no, and as we noted in the paper, that the Ministry for the Environment has already indicated to the Council that they will be, in preparing their advice for the Minister, keen to hear the views of the Council, hence us bringing this issue before you today.
Thank you. Tanya.
I saw on page 26 that we've got the recommendations here, and it was basically asking the Minister to decline the application, but note the potential for a future application once the plan change process has been completed. The sense I got from the report, though, was that one of the major objections we might have is around the fact that there is a science investigation still to be undertaken. So my question is, why wouldn't we ask the Minister to potentially pause considering the application until such time as the science has been completed? Otherwise, the applicants have to wait for the whole plan change process. And that just brings me to another point, and I guess it relates to the next item on the agenda, which is collaboration. If I'm an iwi with limited resources and a lack of faith in the wider public to necessarily appreciate my values, as time has shown, perhaps in the past, then I'm going to ask myself, why would I spend years in a collaborative process talking to people who aren't decision makers, trying to get them to understand me, and they might or they might not. You know, it's difficult to understand why I would commit my resources to that when I actually have an option here to go to perhaps an authority who might not be the Minister but the Special Tribunal who might understand me better.
The time that both of these processes take is a consideration that we should also take into account, in that a water conservation order is not necessarily a fast process. They can be very lengthy, very adversarial, and have a big impact on the relationships of the people that are making submissions to the tribunal. So it's a different sort of process, and it's not necessarily any faster than the collaborative process. And I do understand that the tank group has been in place for some years, and it's reaching the kind of pointy end of the work that it has to do. So it's got to be governed, and this is going to be covered later in James's paper, but good project management and clear understanding of what the outcomes that the tank group needs to deliver are part of that assessment or that analysis. So it's not going to be a faster process, is I guess what we need to understand. The pausing part. Well, that's only a small part of the issues, and the science is necessary in both processes anyway. So again, it comes back to which process do you want to follow to do the same job, essentially.
Kia ora, Mr. Chairman. This JPC committee was formed, and it's a new process, and it's an agent of change, you might say. And I can understand Ngāti Hori's frustration, and over the years the degradation of their awa. But this is for the sake of the integrity of the committee, it is an opportunity for us to make a commitment to improve those rivers, and the tank process appears to be the process that we are following. So I cannot but support the recommendations because we need to support the integrity of this committee in terms of the processes we use. I do sympathise with the problems that are involved with those waterways. As Ngāti Pāhuera, we've been down this process. We objected to a conservation order. We unfortunately lost, but even though we did a Waitangi tribunal on that matter as well.
So you could move it and I could second it, which would give it a bit more gravitas, perhaps, if there's no further questions.
Okay. but
Councillor Barker, we'll go to a question first. Councillor Barker.
Okay. Question, I want to follow up on Tanya's probing about pausing. Given that it's an application by, let's call them an applicant, isn't the process of whether it's paused or not more at their discretion than the receiving party, like the Minister or the Tribunal? So if the issue about pausing or shifting it really rests with the applicants rather than with the Minister?
So at the moment it has been lodged, and so the process is in train. And so the only way in which that could occur, and there's no actual statutory mechanism for this, but I'm sure it can be achieved, is if the applicants wrote to the Minister and asked that he cease considering and effectively that it be withdrawn. I think in practical terms, what's most likely to happen if the Minister did indeed decline the application is that it would be resubmitted for the upper reaches. And so I think that's a possibility. Again, from Council staff perspective, our preference would be that the applicants did not do that until such time as the tank process was completed. If indeed those participants that are also involved in the tank process are genuinely committed to a community-driven, collective and collaborative approach to freshwater planning in the region.
I just sum up to say that the initiative to pause rests with the applicants, not with the Minister. Is that the answer to the question? Just to be clear.
No.
So the Minister could pause it?
He could decline.
He can decline it, or he could sit on it for some time, as has been the case with a range of WCO applications, because there's not a statutory timetable for his decision, as I understand it.
Just a supplement to that, actually. So, is there there's a 10-year window, is it, or is there no upper end to how long they could sit on it?
It's not specified.
So they could just sit on it for, okay. Twisting and bucking and kicking. Any further questions? You're happy to move? Oh, hang on a minute.
List of treaty claims.
Oh, yeah. Right to the treaty. I'm happy
Minister Environment and Minister of Treaty.
I'm happy to second that. Do you wish to speak further?
Yeah.
You're good. I'm good. Any other speakers? Oh, hell, we'll go. Yeah, Councillor Grant.
I very strongly support this, and I think it's a compromise. Firstly, thanks for your, James, very succinct, and Marianne, your first one. So I think you outlined it really well for us. I look at, I wasn't going to say this, but it's the 5 applicants here. It's seems to me like an unholy alliance. It's like Donald Trump and ISIS, and I really don't know who's Donald Trump and who's ISIS, but how does Fish and Game get involved with the forest, who are in the business of killing things, get involved with Forest and Bird? So I was very confused. It's a very eclectic bunch of people here, but I was really annoyed about it in the initial stages. I thought that that we had tank, and I want to answer your question too, Tanya, because we can't give up on each other. You said, why would I bother? Just because you've had 100 years, and I can understand that, of getting kicked in the butt. Why would you bother? Because we can't give up on each other. And if one gets more powerful than the other, or one sector group, or one racial group, or one ethnic group gets more powerful, we will lose as a community. And that's why I'm such a strong supporter of tank, because we're all in the same room, we have the extremist ends, and we have to make a consensus decision as a community. And because it's not just about protecting the environment, it's a huge part of that, but that is in harmony with the jobs that we make. You know, people who I represent in Flaxmere need jobs. So, and we need to create wealth, and we need to create opportunity in our region just as much as we need to protect the environment. And I know that balance has got out of kilter in the last 100 years, and we've got our job here is to put that in balance and in kilter. So that's why I support this. I think that these 5 people went against that and against the wishes of the community because they were frustrated, and I can understand that, their frustration. But we've got to get back in the room together and talk this through and work it out as a community that works for all of us.
Councillor Belford.
I find myself in the rare position of supporting something despite what Councillor Graham has just said. I think this is the prudent path to take, but I think Tanya has teased out very well what the honourable intentions would be of other parties to this process who have sat through a Plan Change 5, and we just heard about that saga, who have sat through a Plan Change 6, which was very unsatisfactory to many of the same interests, environmental, iwi, and so forth. And so for them to size up the prospects of achieving the values that they want by using a process that has been made available expressly for that purpose, to characterize them negatively or maliciously, I think is unbecoming of the council. And there's language in here that kind of verges in that direction. So I don't have any problem if I were an advisor to environmentalists in Hawke's Bay. I would certainly have said to them, take a look at the water conservation order process. If you don't trust the tank process that has been held out as your alternative, well, what other alternatives are before you? So by rejecting this, or by urging the minister to reject this, I think we're taking on an even larger burden, as Rex is implying, of making sure that the tank process has some integrity to it, because if it has to survive this test. Again, people single out, fish and game. Well, there are other parties involved, and there are other parties behind the scenes here who are fully supportive of this water conservation order approach. And we shouldn't demean their motivations in doing it. What's the point of that? You want the big family to come together. Well, then why trash half the table that has no trust in the process that we're being asked to buy into? In the next go around here, we're going to try to resolve that issue. We're going to try to fix tank in some way, shape, or form. But right now, it's broken. It doesn't represent a legitimate option, in my view, to this water conservation order. So I have full, as far as I'm concerned, good on them, just as it was good on Nikki to do what they did on Plan Change 5. They used a process at their avail. I'm going to support this, as I said, but I would not want to see us get in the business of trashing the folks who feel like the only way their interests can be protected based on the experience that they have had dealing with this council over the last decade or so has been a failure in their eyes.
Close. Very close. Okay, any other speakers? You wish to sum up, Toro? You good? Put the motion in. All those in favour, obviously with that amendment that we also write to the Minister of Treaty Settlements. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, no. Carried. Thank you. Right. Oh, you're off to a start there, Mr. Palmer. So, future of the Greater Heratonga